Very good evening and welcome to the India Development Debate. I'm Tamanna Inamdar and we have a cracker of a show lined up for you this evening. Let me quickly tell you what's going on. So now there's a fresh fight brewing between the centre and the state over GST compensation. The centre is lawyering up with the Attorney General, informing them that the states are perhaps not eligible for the makeup of shortfall that they're demanding from the centre in GST revenue because the act doesn't cover something like coronavirus. We're going to get into detail on that story, and I will be joined by the Kerala Finance Minister Dr. Thomas Issac. Stay tuned for that. There is a global market sell-off. US markets in a bit of shock after the worst quarterly GDP numbers ever, down 32% year on year. Plus Donald Trump asking on Twitter whether the polls should be postponed. So a lot of action happening there. We will get you perspective on that story, and please do stay till the end of the show, till half of the show, to hear from Rajiv Bajaj. That's a big exclusive where he talks about lockdown, what happened in the Waluj plant, and also explains why he will never take the coronavirus vaccine. So a lot lined up. Let's get to the first big story and tell you what's happening. So a big fight brewing between centre and state over GST compensation. Remember, GST revenues have dropped over 40% in Q1 this year, and it's obviously because of the lockdown and the coronavirus pandemic, etc. A bit of recovery in June, but overall 40% drop. Now, as per the rules, the centre has to compensate the states for any shortfall they have by 14% year on year. They have to do this for 5 years. So far, the centre has managed up till March 2020 by dipping into excess reserves which were collected in previous years. This is basically the extra cesses we pay on items. So that made up the shortfall till March 2020. Since then, payments have not been made, and now the centre has taken legal counsel from the Attorney General, and sources tell us that the Attorney General is saying the centre has no obligation to pay states for that shortfall if it is induced by something like the coronavirus pandemic, because the act says that the shortfall should happen because of implementing the GST. How are states going to react to this? How is it all going to work out? Because remember, at the crux of this is the fact that no one can really predict where GST revenues or the economy is going. Let me begin by getting on board Dr. Thomas Issac, Finance Minister for the state of Kerala. Dr. Issac, thank you for speaking with us. Pleasure to have you on the show. Let me ask you straight up. What we're hearing is that the centre's legal counsel is telling them they have no obligation to pay states like yours that shortfall and make up that shortfall when it's been caused by something like the coronavirus pandemic. What's your response?
I don't think GST losses, whether to compensate or not compensate, should depend upon the reason why the collection has fallen short of 14% growth. This only says the collection fails to keep up with 14% growth, the states would have to be compensated. Therefore, I don't agree with that legal interpretation at all. The reason why the collection is not buoyant may be of many reasons, including that you have reduced the tax rates, the IT backbone is not ready, and so on and so forth, and also that there is a recession in the economy. Now, I don't know what kind of interpretation is done. If you are going to argue that this unforeseen circumstances, therefore the law does not envisage compensation. No, I don't agree with it at all.
You have tweeted out, Dr. Thomas, after reports that the central government in the Standing Committee on Finance has taken a stance that the current terms between the centre and states on GST should be revisited, that they cannot pay the compensation which is due. You've called it a betrayal of federal trust. What are you hoping happens in the next GST Council meet? What are the proposals that you have in mind?
GST compensation was a single issue that had been debated in the GST Council most extensively, I think in around 5 council meetings. And after all deliberations, when we formulated what should be the law. And in fact, in one meeting, somebody raised the issue, what if the revenues, the compensation Cess fund is not is sufficient to pay the compensation? Then finance minister, undoubtedly, gave a assurance to the council. If such eventuality comes, it's very simple. The council can borrow and pay you compensation, and then maybe extend the cess for yet another year instead of 5 years, 6 years, so that loan can be repaid. So that was the assurance. That is the guarantee which was given. Now, after having discussed so much, and that the basic condition on which states agreed to come for this GST law, they used to be without an explanation. See, this discussion has been going on for the last 6 months. Last month, when the GST Council met, it was agreed we'll have a meeting in July, and to discuss exclusively this issue. And all states were to submit to the Union Ministry their proposal how this situation can be addressed. So I suppose all states are given, no council has met. Without the council meeting, you go to the parliamentary standing committee and tell them that, well, there is no guarantee that you can pay the compensation. That's a basic betrayal of federal trust here, if that is not what is it then. This is not the way that we should try to address and solve an issue, grave issue. And look at the logic of this. You have having one of the biggest recession that India has seen. And central government is trying to have a package, 20 lakh stimulus package and so on and so forth. So they are trying to stimulate the economy by increasing the expenditure. Then you are telling the states you have to cut your expenditure because we can't pay you compensation. Now, at least think this is part of the stimulus package here. That states spend 60% of the overall intergovernmental expenditure in the country. So on the one hand, the center tries to expand, and on the other hand, they're trying to cut the expenditure of the states. And this makes no macroeconomic sense.
Dr. Thomas, the loudest voices and the most vocal ones really on the issue of compensation, at least publicly, have been from the states of Kerala, West Bengal and Punjab, and non-BJP states. Is this becoming a political issue?
I don't know what is the issue. It's not political because in the Goa meeting, all ministers, including BJP ministers, said we will not discuss this issue at all. That's how that discussion ended. Later, when it did come up for discussion at the GST Council, many ministers, BJP ministers, including Sushil Kumar Modi, said, well, this can be done by borrowing additional money for temporary money for bridging the gap. So it cuts across political division. All the states are in serious trouble here, very serious trouble, financial trouble, because the revenues have shrunk so much. So therefore, everybody is in trouble. So I don't think it's a political issue at all. Some people, I don't know, I can't lay my hands on it. Think you can take, you can just roughshod the state interest, ignore it. Which is very sad here.
So we're in a situation now, Dr. Issac, where the centre seems like it will be strapped for funds to compensate states at the rates which were predetermined. Overall, GST revenues are dropping and there's no clear way out. So what happens next? What happens if the centre is unable to compensate the states? What will be the repercussions of this?
The statement is so funny and false. The solution is simple, yeah. Solution is you borrow 1 lakh, 1.5 lakh crore rupees and pay to the state, compensates the states. It does not need even to enter the fiscal deficits of center. If the council borrows, the central government has already empowered the council to borrow, and then you extend the cess period from 5 to 6. So simple. So you don't have to, what is the revenue of the central government, etc., doesn't matter. Now, what would be the implication of this? So Kerala, for example, for the months of April to June, I think with a bilateral compensator, something like 6,000 crores rupees. That's quite a big money. That's a big money. Now we are having the spike in Kerala. Numbers of increasing, the COVID cases. I think it is going to peak in end of August, which would mean that we would expect something like 1 lakh cases or even more. So we are very fast, very rapidly setting up COVID first-line treatment centers and so on and so forth. We are not having a total lockdown of the state, but selective lockdowns. And if you want people to cooperate, you have to ensure they get their livelihood, minimum food. Okay, not just rice alone, condiments and so on and so forth. That has to be assured to people minimum. And where do you get the money from? See, this is very serious. In this kind of crisis situation, one, central government has to be forthcoming and supporting. Two, as I told you again earlier, this does not make any macro sense. Yet policy-wise, you are forcing state governments which account for 60% of intergovernmental expenditure in India to cut their expenditure in recessionary time. You are going to aggravate the recession in India. So if you ask me what's going to happen, one, states will not have sufficient money to meet the contingent liabilities that could emerge from the COVID. So there will be certain problems with our addressing this crisis. Secondly, the recession in India is going to worsen.
All right, we'll have to wait and see where the solutions come from. But meanwhile, thank you so much, Dr. Issac, for speaking with us today. Thomas Issac there, Finance Minister of the state of Kerala, not mincing his words, saying that it makes no sense to ask states to curtail their expenses at this time. We have to find a way to give the states the compensation they need. But how do you find the money? To help me answer that question, I'm joined now by Najib Shah, former chairman of the CBEC and MS Mani, partner at Deloitte. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Shah, let me just begin by getting your take on the kind of fight that is brewing. Do you see an easy and clear solution here? What are the options on the table?
No easy solutions at all. Simply because even the last fiscal, the centre has released something like 1,65,000 crores as compensation to the states, but collected only around 95,000 crores. So there's a shortfall there of 70,000 crores, which they made good by taking money from their earlier years' cess amounts, and more importantly, also dipping into the Consolidated Fund of India. So, as you rightly pointed out, the fiscal position is dismal. The centre has indeed, as Dr. Issac pointed out, committed itself very early on to compensate the states for the possible loss because of migration. The problem really arises not in this commitment, but in the methodology in which we worked out this commitment, assuming a 14% growth on a 15-16 base, which has not happened at all, which is why you have this very strange phenomena of states like Tripura, Assam, Bihar, all destination states, which were never really in the scheme of states being compensated, also receiving compensation, which is an indication really of how bad the fiscal position is. And also because of the guarantee of compensation, the states becoming very lethargic in collecting the revenues which they otherwise ought to be collecting. Now, what is the solution? Borrowing is a solution which Dr. Issac has mentioned. I think the government will think 5 times before doing that. One possible solution, if the states extend a hand of cooperation, is to relook at this 14% rate itself and see whether we can come to a more realistic rate. Yes, this is an issue which is hotly debated. The first 5 GST Council meetings debated nothing but the methodology of arriving at a GST compensation. So it's going to be a very, very difficult call. The other options are increasing the rates. That will not be an acceptable solution to anybody. But then by increasing the GST rates, you reduce the amount of money to be compensated, or you increase the compensation cess rates itself. But will that be good enough to compensate and bring to the kitty 70, 80,000 odd crores, which is the difference right now, is very, very unlikely. So solutions are very difficult. A, borrow. B, you sit down with the states and make them understand that, look, we all have to be realistic. If they're not getting money, the center also is not getting money. Can we look at a rate which is not 14%, but something like 12 or 10 or whatever, whereby the center's commitment can be honored? Dr. Issac has rightly pointed out that's a commitment which has to be honored, and I'm sure the center will not renegade on this particular commitment.
You know, no, but the thing is, then again, now where's the money? Now, you mentioned, sir, that 14% was always difficult to achieve. But the fact is that that's what got the states on board in the first place. So there's no point going back and saying whether it's doable or not. MS Mani, one of the options on the table being talked about is to rework the entire deal, very simply put, should we rationalize this 14% or to what extent the states are compensated? States are not going to stand for it. The other option that the states are talking about is, let's borrow money. Let's borrow as the GST Council. That's one of the options which is being talked about. My question is, how would the mechanics of that work? Who would the borrower be? Who would guarantee that loan?
Yeah, Tamanna, I think these are very difficult times, and possibly what has happened is that when the GST compensation law was being worked out, I don't think anyone anticipated we would have a pandemic in the world. And therefore, we are discussing something which, commercially is referred to as a force majeure. And normally when you have a force majeure intervention in any commercial law, any previous understanding, it is always understood that the parties to the transaction would sit and have some kind of reasonable renegotiation. So if arising out of that, there is some amount of renegotiation between the center and states, where they come to some reasonable number, whatever is worked out by the panel of experts that constitute this, that I think would be very good. Now, to your question in terms of how would the borrowing be, I think the mechanics will need to be worked out in a lot of detail, because the GST Council typically is a federal body. It is not a corporate entity. Now, when you have a federal body like the GST Council, I would say a creature of the law, how would they go about and borrow, and who would guarantee that? Now, together with that, there is also the question that the moment you say that there is a need to borrow, there is also a need to plan for the repayment. So how would that repayment happen at that point of time? Now, on the repayment subject, one of the things that I would like to bring to your attention is the fact that when the states and the center were negotiating before the GST launch, in one of the GST Council meetings, I recollect it was the 8th meeting of the GST Council, the meeting had a discussion on the subject of what happens if the center is unable to compensate the state for a loss of revenue, not in the context of a pandemic, but in a general context. And at that point of time, the then finance minister had agreed in that meeting, and this is minuted in the GST meeting records also, by saying that one of the options that will be explored is to see whether we can go ahead with a borrowing, and that borrowing can be repaid by continuing with the cess, possibly for the 6th year and 7th year. Because right now the center is obliged to pay the states for 5 years, which ends in 2022. So if the center goes ahead and borrows in order to bridge the present shortfall, they also have an option of continuing with the cess, although I'm sure that will be extremely unpopular with business, for 2 years, possibly after 22, and use the proceeds from that revenue generation to repay the loans. And this I'm just mentioning not as something that I recommend. To my mind, the cess has to end in 2022. But this is one of the options which was discussed in the 8th GST Council meeting as well.
But you know, you are bang on, Mani. You are bang on because from my conversations with various stakeholders, this is one of the options they seriously want to look at in the next GST Council meet. But I have a slightly different concern. I'm hoping and assuming that center and state will work this out. They absolutely have to, because then everyone suffers, and they will keep up the sort of ability of the GST Council to make bipartisan decisions. My question is that in the middle of all of this, no one is even going to entertain the need for dropping GST rates, which is a really valid question right now. If you want to spur on consumption, if you want to improve demand, then you may at some point have to look at reducing GST rates. In this scenario, no one is even going to entertain a thought on that, Mani.
I agree, Tamanna, and I would say that while any drop in the GST rates, specifically for sectors which are under a high degree of stress, there is a very good business case for reducing the rates of GST. Possibly, what we have to bear in mind is that for virtually all products, the rates that are in vogue at present are far below the earlier revenue neutral rates, which was a combination of the excise and the VAT. For virtually every product, we are far below that. And therefore, is there a bandwidth for reduction? From a collection standpoint, I think the answer is a clear no. In fact, I understand when the compensation cess issue has been brought up in the past, one of the suggestions that has been given is that either we increase the rates of cess on the products where it is already applied, or we broaden the base of the products to which cess applies. Now, both of them, to my mind, won't work at all, and that should not be encouraged at all, which essentially means that we are just left with some form of market borrowing, and we need to figure out a mechanism for that.
Mr. Shah, do you think that there will be a clear solution out of this mess, and hopefully there will not be any entertainment of increasing rates, either the slabs or the number of items that come under the higher slabs? Do you think that there will be pressure to give in to these temptations?
Look, we have been talking of the challenge of where the money is going to come from and how the money is going to come from. The only possible way from where money can come from is by increasing rates. Obviously, this is not going to be an acceptable solution at all to anybody. And like Mr. Mani pointed out, the rates currently are far, far lesser than the rates as they were. So, but having said that, there's no question of increasing rates. So in my opinion, again, we need to sit down with the states. The problem is not just on the center. Undoubtedly, the center has guaranteed that we will give you the compensation for 5 years, and 14% also was the rate mentioned. But I think they both need to accept the fact that we are facing an unprecedented situation. Perhaps we need to sit down and talk to each other to see where we can get a solution. Borrowing, of course, is a solution which is always available. And who will guarantee except for the center the states are not going to guarantee. They'll insist that it is you who have to give me the money. So you jolly well guarantee and jolly well borrow from wherever. As far as the states are concerned, they put the entire onus on the center. Now, all I'm suggesting is that it is a responsibility to be shared both by the state and the center, simply because it is everybody's concern. It is not as if the center is not giving revenue which is being collected.
Yeah. Absolutely. It is a crisis that needs to be tided over at this point. We'll track the story very carefully and we keep giving you updates on this, including perspectives from other states as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Najib Shah and Mani, for joining us on the first discussion this evening on the India Development Debate.